Ukraine. Hello and welcome everybody to another, I guess we would just say impromptu, spontaneous somewhat, two liberals and a Marxist, which is again the sort of unofficial term for these three-way live streams that myself, Piotr Curzon of the Global Gambit, James Ker-Lindsay of James Ker-Lindsay, and Michael Rossi of Michael Rossi YouTube channels do. I think we do these on a bi-monthly basis. A sort of, I think that's the general theme, guys. We sort of gather at, occasional moments to sort of review, reflect on major geopolitical and economic developments. And I think we last did one just after the aftermath of Operation Absolute Resolve. So about, 5 weeks ago? Seems all sort of the same kind of month, to be honest with you. The event, I look at things mainly through geopolitical developments now and not through sort of seasonal calendars anymore. My upload schedule certainly reflects that, I think. But anyway, it's lovely to have you both. We're on the show again, as always. Although we're kind of all hosting this, I guess. How are you both? And where should we begin? I think we're going to mainly talk about NATO, Russia, Ukraine, and yeah, that sort of the peace talks, casualty rates, I think. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you guys. Open floor, I think.
Michael, why don't you go first?
Okay, that was a great update there, guys.
I have to say we need to start texting each other. One of us is going to go first every other time here. Well, it's good to see you all once again. Greetings from the East Coast, where we are about to get hit once again with snow. Not as bad as the last time around, but that snow that we got at the end of January is still around. So it's just going to add to the misery here. But as far as the rest of the world is concerned, I don't know on how to make of what has been transpiring over the past couple of weeks, because a lot has been happening, but at the same time, very little has been happening. There's been a lot of posturing. There's been rhetoric. There have been many statements by elements of the Trump regime that breakthroughs are inevitable when it comes to Iran. The peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in Geneva a few days ago were praised, at least initially, as the next step in finding a negotiated solution. I don't know if to my knowledge, there was really no major breakthrough whatsoever. And out of that, we get statements from elements within Zelensky's government that Ukraine needs to really prepare for the next 2 to 3 years of a sustained war, that they are not going to cede any territory. Even with the promise of accelerated EU membership, which I don't think anybody really believes is the sinecure to anything here. So it seems like, unless I'm missing something, that aside from the first 3 to 4 days of 2026, when a lot happened, everything since has just been the repercussive fallouts and the responses.
I think it would be, Michael, I don't know if you would, maybe we could sort of say it's not so much directly in the Ukrainian sphere as it is in the broader sort of transatlanticism. I think it's
which I know that we are talking, and we can and should stay specifically with the subject on Ukraine, Russia, and NATO, but it's hard to decouple that now from everything else that's happening around the world. Latin America, Israel, Iran, and what have you.
I think you could probably, just to chip in there and then I'll hand it to you, James, I think it's simply a case of the war front has been relatively static, although we've seen the harrowing casualty numbers that have emerged in terms of, especially on Russia's side. The Russian economy is looking pretty bad. I made a video last week about it's not so much collapsing as it is cannibalizing itself. I think that was the sort of the framing I made for that video. It's just beginning to eat itself alive in terms of, if you look at the fiscal and monetary conditions. And obviously we've had the Munich Security Conference just gone, the World Economic Forum. I guess the main highlight for me, if we put it in the context of, say, so NATO and Europe and everything, is Mark Carney's speech. I think that is going to be one of the most important geopolitical foreign policy framings for this year. May I say put so much emphasis on that, because I staunchly agree with much of Carney's outlook. This principled pragmatism, I wrote a piece in Newsweek about that, and I think that's going to be a huge element there. And this growing willingness of middle powers, right? Lots of floating around of extended EU with Canada, or also I think how do you pronounce it? Kanozuk, or how do you pronounce it? The
Kanzuk.
Kanzuk, yes. So I think these are.
I've always been more skeptical on that, but we can delve into that maybe another time.
Anyway, it's all yours, James. Cheers.
Yeah, look, I mean, where to start? Look, you're absolutely right. Things seem to have gone remarkably quiet, and it's not entirely clear why. I mean, obviously, we're coming up for a major anniversary, of the 4 years since the start of this conflict, which at the time everyone was thinking was going to be over in 3 days, 3 weeks at most, and here we are. And it's difficult to make sense of where everything stands. I mean, we've obviously seen Trump take a close interest in all of this, trying to solve it, for the sake of a Nobel Peace Prize. And he seems to have gone very quiet on it recently, which, depends how you look at it, is a good or a bad thing. There have been these talks going on, but Michael, you follow sort of, the Russian presentation of things much more closely. And it sounds like Russia has been taking the position that it's not going to back away from its original demands, essentially.
No.
And certainly isn't going to be in a mood to negotiate away the territorial gains it's made on the battlefield. And then, of course, as was mentioned, I mean, with President Zelensky saying, well, equally, we're not willing to give up the territory that we've gained, our sovereign territory, that it does seem that this territorial issue, which I think all of us who were looking at this knew that this was always going to be a stalemate, you were certainly never going to get, and I don't think, not that I can dictate what Ukraine does, but I, for regular viewers know that I've always been very, very concerned about the idea that Russia would ever be rewarded with any sort of legitimate claim to territory as a result of this war, because it completely upends an international system that has been based precisely on the principle that conquest of territory is no longer legal. And to reverse that would have absolutely dire consequences. But it seemed that Trump was pushing in that direction. It seems now that Ukraine isn't going to give in on that. So it's very difficult to get a sense, isn't it, of where exactly we stand.
Well, James, if I can chip in on that, I would say a couple things. For me, I think what's notable, if we look at the tactical level, right, or the national level, the micro level of just Ukraine, Zelensky has floated the idea that they may hold elections in the spring, which, if that were to occur, I think would be huge for the momentum, both physical but also psychological framing for the Russians. Ultimately, I think anyone of a reasonable mind has understood that the minute it became apparent that this wasn't going to be a 3-day SMO and an actually protracted conflict, that it was going to be determined by factors off the battlefield, i.e. the complete disintegration of Ukraine's defense lines because of the discontinuation of support from the United States especially, but possibly broader Europe, or infighting in Europe at least, or the implosion of the Russian economy, or the Russian head of state, an inner circle sort of power struggle, right? Those are more of the, I think, determining factors. But if we look at the broader strategic level, to your point about the rejection of the prevailing international system since 1945, that's why I think the speeches at World Economic Forum was so important, and subsequent developments in the Munich Security Conference just a week ago, because they outline that certain Western actors are taking concerted efforts to decouple or de-risk, or in my vocabulary, I like to use the word diversify, to diversify away from the United States, both in an economic and diplomatic sense, right? Mark Carney, the Europeans, the British were in China, the Europeans were in China, the Europeans have signed this significant trade agreement with the Indian government. These are huge strategic shifts, which whilst might not directly impact on Ukraine, I think have a huge illustration of the overall unity or divergence of America's approach to the war and, you know, European, Canadian, and so on. So I think whilst they haven't been as urgent developments, I think we've seen some larger, bigger, gradual ones that will have bigger impact later on in the year, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think the thing to bear in mind in all of this is that I did take issue with Carney's speech. I know that it's been widely lauded, but I was speaking with a very good friend of mine who, we often talk on international relations. He's professor of international relations as well, and sort of and we were both saying that it was actually surprisingly disturbing because Carney was actually undermining the rules-based order that, in fact, he should have been trying to preserve. He was sort of saying, this has been too often exploited by great powers, and he's sort of presenting that as the norm rather than sort of saying, no, it has been violated and that is wrong, but we should preserve it because it's the basis of an international system that actually allows these trading relationships to work amongst many other things that it allows to work. So I felt that, I think,
wow,
in many ways, Carney was right about things, but I didn't like that tone.
I have to be honest, mate. I completely disagree with you. Well, largely disagree with you. I think it was a remarkable speech because he's recognizing things as they are.
I'm not saying it wasn't a good speech, but what I am saying is that I think he was fundamentally wrong on that. I think he was undermining a system that he should have been trying to preserve.
But it is already undermined. He's just simply adapting to it. He's not trying to hold on to the remnants.
Trying to. I don't think Canada's standing out as a country that's trying to undermine international law and order. What he was, as I say, I think, like so much, I think we're in a phase where a lot of us are hearing, it's like the Rubio speech. Rubio's speech, if you look at how that went down at the Munich Security Forum, the first 24 hours, it was being lauded. Everyone was saying how brilliant it was. And then everyone started to think a little bit about it. And it was actually cast as something actually quite bad in all sorts of ways. It was nicer than what Barnes was saying, but it certainly wasn't. It wasn't the sort of nice message that everyone wanted it to be. And I think that there is this, at the moment, we're very much, because of this uncertainty, we hear things, but not necessarily listen. And I think this is the problem I had with the Carney speech. I think it was a very good speech in many ways, but I think that underlying element that he was saying, he was actually wrong about. And I think...
Can I interject here? Simply because... just for the sake of our viewers and whatever, what specifically was it within
what statement which you took issue
with?
It was the idea that when he was talking about the rules-based order had been it had far too often worked for the great powers, and I disagree with that. I think that was the wrong framing. That it has far too often been worked for the great powers. I think he should have been saying is that the rules-based order is something that we want to preserve. It's important. It has given us a lot of international law, but too often great powers have done what they wanted. Mm-hmm. That's the message, not that the rules-based order works for the great powers and that the great powers, that's not the message he should have been sending. Mm-hmm. He should have been saying these guys, whether it's Russia, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, Britain, France, whoever, have you abused their power at different points to undermine that system. But we need to get back to that basic system because that is the system that has allowed the world to prosper in many ways. And the point I keep making is that people will look to Iraq, people will look to Ukraine and say this is proof that the international system, the rules-based system, doesn't work. No, these are major violations of that system. But that system, as I've said before, works every day in thousands of ways.
Yeah.
And this is what Carney should have been saying. We need to get back to that and not have a system where great powers can violate it, because that system relies, the integrity of it is everyone follows the rules. And that's starting to break down now. And we need to get back to a place where countries have trust in that system.
Okay, so a couple of things from me, and then I want to pass it to Michael, because I could see this is where we're all getting quite like, oh, I want to jump in on that point. And, then we have our moments of like talking over one another, which people, look, I interpreted your statement slightly different to the point you were making. Personally, I think what Mark Carney said, perhaps in the framing, could have been slightly different in your opinion, but to me, largely his bottom line, I think, was incredibly astute.
Yes, I agree, but I think he framed it wrong in that sense.
I personally think that we need to behave in a world, and I'm primarily talking about Europe in this regard, because the West is a nebulous term, which I've never really liked. Constitutes 40, 50 different countries with very different cultural and political and economic conditions and outlooks. And we need to behave in a world as it is, not as we want it to be. And that's where I think the joke of two liberals and a Marxist is funny, because I'm a bit more of a pragmatist. I don't know. But I think that Mark Carney has a point. And this goes to what you're saying, James, which is that we need to return to the rules-based order. My consideration with that is that I just don't think that's possible anymore. I think we're so far in this political rupture, in this inflection point of grand strategic changes and priorities of the big powers, that I find it very difficult to see how we can simply return to the yesteryears of, the ideals and values, the norms that represent that international order. Again, not because I don't like it, I prefer that idea, but I just don't know how realistic it is, right? One of the conversations I had with Ben Hodges on the show quite often, that I'll be releasing after our talk, is simply about, Gavin Newsom and AOC were at the Munich Security Conference, partially for their own efforts to try to build, credibility as a candidate for 29, but also because they're trying to sort of reassure Europeans that a better America will return. But to me, I don't think it's like that anymore. I think that the new reality, like the new normal after COVID, is here. That the relationship between the United States and Europe is never going to be the same, nor should it be, because I do think Europe was overly reliant, overly naive in their relationship with the Americans. No credit, no hate on the Americans, but we need to get up on our own 2 feet and be a lot more self-sufficient, autonomous. And therefore, that means a little bit of maybe to your discontent, but rejection or reevaluation of the international rules-based order as it used to be. But, I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but sort of
Michael, can I just jump in on this? And I think that this is where I think we're making too much of what we're seeing at the moment. I think there are terrible violations going on. But again, I come back to the fundamental point that the international system is built on a whole range of international law, international institutions, most of which are still doing amazing work, that countries by and large respect treaties, that they want it to work. And even when you talk about Europe and a greater emphasis on European strategic autonomy, which is something I absolutely believe in, and think is incredibly important now, and this has been proven. But remember, of course, that the whole European model is based on rules, that Europe stands for following rules. And this is where I think that Mark Carney got it wrong by undermining it, because what he should have been saying is, look, those countries of the West and those countries of other parts of the world which believe in international law, that see the value in respecting borders, see the value in not tearing up trade agreements, see the value in preserving treaties that they've signed with each other, all things that Russia and the United States have thrown out of the window, need to work with each other to preserve that. And most countries, if that message can be sent, are going to sign up to it. And so that's where my difference comes in. So I think, I don't think we're necessarily arguing against each other. I think that what we have to bear in mind, though, is when we talk about European strategic autonomy and Europe having a greater say, remembering what that say is built on, what European unity is built on. It's 27 sovereign states and others which have built that system precisely on following rules and laws.
But we need to be consistent in its implementation, James. We need to stop. This is why I like the idea of principled pragmatism, or what Alexander Stubbs, the president, the leader of Finland, calls values-based realism, right? If we're going to be consistent in our messaging, we also need to be consistent in our actions. And it's the past 20 years where we talked about this in our previous stream, right? The idea of R2P, the idea of, going into Kosovo. I know I've triggered some people in the comments now. These or Libya, right? Based on the idea of liberal interventionism, right? But then we actually make the situation worse. So if Europe's going to behave like that, it's only my
I completely agree. I don't think we've got any difference on that. I think, but this is also where you highlight a very important contradiction, which my swallowing my tongue there, between those positions of Europe saying we believe in international law, but at the same time we believe that we can break international law if the circumstances are right. And I think that this is very problematic. And so yeah, I fully accept that. But also at the same time, then you run smack bang into this idea that, and I think also times have changed. I think that the Europe of 25 years ago, at the time of Kosovo, it was a very different era, and it sort of said, right, okay, we have a civilizing mission, if you like, that we believe that this idea of sovereignty, dictators can't hide behind it anymore. I mean, I think in many ways it was said for the right reasons. And it was this idea that Europe has got beyond its bloody past and conflict, and wanting to sort of take that message to the outside world. But now I think European leaders are, in that sense, being more pragmatic, that it's not about interfering in other countries, but it's, if you want to preserve that system of international law, then you're going to have to accept doing pragmatic deals with countries.
It's selective engagement, isn't it? It's the term selective restraint, selective engagement. This is what I'm about. Picking the battles, so to speak, not literal ones, that you can win, right? The Europeans, I think, have done a very good job with India. They've established a very fundamental trade agreement. The Europeans do have the capacity of an economic power. Look at Mercosur, right? This negotiation that has been going on for 30 years, and we've finally seen the Europeans establish a remarkable free trade agreement with the free trade zone, whatever, of Latin America. That's a huge blow to Trump. And whilst he continues to leverage his tariffs, look at the Supreme Court decision just on Friday, and now he's enacting under Section 232, I think it is, the maximum amount of global tariffs he can at 15%, all because he's reactionary and pissed off that the people he put into the Supreme Court have still come out and voted against him. Right?
What was it? The lovely thing. Sorry, Mike, I can't resist.
It's a good thing because it demonstrates the democracy in America.
I'm just taking notes.
No, I was just laughing, Piotr, because I remember sort of a while back somebody had predicted that the court would do this, because after they gave Trump immunity, they said you can mess around with American politics as much as you like, but don't mess around with our economic system.
No, but even the people, right? Trump deliberately, at the end of his last term, he put in a couple of people from the GOP side, and they've still voted against him.
But that's the point. The point is you can mess around with American politics as much as you like, but don't mess around with our economic system. And that's what the court effectively said, that we'll give you immunity. You can be a king, but don't start doing things you're not meant to do.
We should have a debate on that as well. Anyway, Michael, you've probably given up.
Yeah, sorry, Michael. We sort of, on this.
Well, the first thing is that I think we ought to rename ourselves. Instead of two liberals and a Marxist, we really should, within the last 10 minutes, we really should call ourselves a pragmatist, a Marxist, and an idealist, because that is ultimately what...
Are you actually a Marxist, Michael?
What is a Marxist in this day and age? You know what? When someone calls themselves a Marxist, do you want to know who or where you're going to get the biggest criticism from for calling yourself other Marxists? Okay, I mean, nobody critiques Marxists better than other Marxists. So I'm not even sure. I think in comparison to you two fine folk, book. I guess I am the Marxist in the room. I have no idea what the hell I am anymore. But
well, as a staunch capitalist, I'll say that I'll fly you out to London. James flies into London. We've got to do this in person because it's very entertaining. Sorry.
That's fine. I have no problem doing that. I mean, at some stage of the game, I need to see the two of you in person.
No, I really want to meet
no
you
question
guys.
about that.
Hilarious.
All right, let me say that from at least my own perspective here, from the Marxist, note the air quoting, the Marxist perspective here, okay? When I had asked, James, can you at least clarify for everybody what you meant by taking issue with Carney's speech? I absolutely agree, right? I absolutely agree. And the first thing that came to my mind is that this is nothing new, right? What you're effectively talking about is something that E.H. Carr mentioned, he wrote about in this seminal work of his, The 20 Years Crisis, which, James, I'm sure you are familiar with. Piotr, you might have read it in grad school, whatever. 20 Years Crisis.
It's essentially the foundation text of modern international relations as a discipline.
Right. So the 20 Years Crisis, 1918 to 1933, it's effectively the 20 years in between the end of World War I, World War II, right? The TLDR version of 20 Years Crisis is that the international system is nothing more than the national interests of the hegemonic powers. He may have started out as a liberalist, but ended up becoming a very jaded Marxist. And Marxists in IR theory are either realists who don't like to be realists or liberalists who realize that this is effectively nothing more than great power politics redesigned as feel-good rules-based order. If the international law works in my favor, I will push it. If international law and rules-based order doesn't, I will circumvent it, simply because I have the diplomatic clout, the military wherewithal, and the economic leverage to do what I want. So in this case, once again, James and I take two different routes, but we come to the same end point, right? So in this regard—
I'm not a Marxist, by the way.
No, okay, but you're taking this whole idea of what you're effectively saying is that if the rules-based order is going to work, then the people, the states, the major powers that are enforcing rules-based order have to follow the rules of their own.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Then in that regard, this is effectively what makes or breaks liberalism in IR theory. Liberalism works if and only if everyone agrees to play by the rules of the game. And the worst part about liberalism and the stuff that gives the realists, the Marxists, and to a lesser extent the constructivists, but the realists like Mearsheimer, like Stephen Walt and others, their moment of saying "I told you so" is when the biggest violators of the system are the ones that are insisting on the sacrosanctity of this law. And so in this regard, I absolutely agree. But the problem that we've, and Piotr, you had mentioned R2P, which for everybody in the audience means the right to protect, or it's the responsibility. That's right, the responsibility to protect, which is part of a UN declaration that was passed only as recently as 2009. But it effectively gives some rhetorical legitimacy to elements of the UN Charter, which is ultimately two things. Number one, states that are, sovereign today are not simply sovereign simply by their ability to control the territory that they lay claim to, but they have to have some kind of responsibility to provide a standard of living for everyone living within that territory, right? And if that state cannot do that, the big question is, and this is more moral than legal, but what's very interesting and important about liberalism is that morality will oftentimes overshadow, circumvent, trump legality. And that is, if we see that there is injustice in the world being committed against a group of people by a state, does the international community have the right, the moral obligation to intervene on behalf of those victimize those aggrieved people. Do we, in this day and age, post-1945, post-World War II, post-Holocaust, have the moral obligation to intervene? Which is one of the reasons that legitimizes much of the intervention of many of the great powers of the world. Now, here is where it gets problematic, because not every country has the ability to intervene and, quote unquote, do something about it. Those countries that do, the United States, Russia, the UK, France, the big issue that we find here is that their reason for intervening, their reason for interfering in the internal affairs of other countries can certainly be played up in the idea that we are going in to protect human rights, to push back against minority violations and other elements like that. But it almost always comes, Piotr, you also kind of answered James's point here by saying that this is selective. This is very much selective.
Yeah.
We give a damn about certain human rights violations in parts of the world that interest the great powers. And when human rights violations, genocide, ethnic expulsion, and other horrible, horrible things are happening in peripheral parts of the world are taking place, we don't care. And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff takes place in Africa. Notice that, we all know that nobody did anything as far as Rwanda was concerned, and for a very simple reason, that it's Rwanda. It's a country in somewhere around Central Africa. And a lot of that was predicated on the idea of not wanting to get involved because of what had happened in Somalia. The whole Black Hawk Down incident basically just, killed the entire reason for going in. Somalia, I remember, I think all of us were around at that time. We remember seeing in the early 1990s images of starving people, starving children, this idea that we once again have to do something. We go in, it backfires. There's lots of other reasons behind why it backfired. But immediately after the Black Hawk Down incident, we all pull out. We say, screw this. Rwanda takes place 2 years later. We don't give a damn whatsoever. Yeah. But yet the very same people that are in charge of the whole rules-based order are talking about how we have to have this moral obligation to, make the world better in the 21st century. And it's a bit hard to take when the very same countries turn blind eye and deaf ear to human rights violations in areas around the world that doesn't interest them, or even worse, instigates, funds, supports human rights violations committed by certain countries because it is also politically and diplomatically expedient. So this is the burden of liberalism, which is the reason why, Piotr, I think that you're much more of the pragmatist. I'm the pessimistic doomer Marxist. And James, bless your heart, and I say that not in a Southern way. I say that truly. I love you, I love you dearly. The minute that you and I are, in the same place, we are going to get lit together. Okay, seriously, I can't wait. I really cannot wait for that.
If I can just interject,
Michael's drinking medium for me. I'm drinking tea.
I'm drinking.
What can I say? But I mean,
a true international liberalist.
Let me finish up by saying is that I absolutely get where James is coming from. I get it. We both get it. I understand it, right? And at the end of the day, perhaps, James, you are the only one that still believes in this cause, where both Piotr and I are like, well, at the end of the day, the states are going to do their own thing. Or in my case, it's like horrible things are going to happen no matter what. But what? We need people. No, we need people like Jake. We need people like you to effectively.
Thank you.
Look, I get it. Rules-based order, the biggest violators of rules-based order are the biggest proponents of rules-based order. And it's
a lot more introspective of a conversation, though, as I was expecting. This is like a
likewise.
I need to be on the sofa.
But I think it's important. I think it's important.
I just have a couple of things to say, and then I'll pass it to you, James, or whatever. But for me, it's quite simple. I wasn't around when the first AMNISOM mission undertook. Right, I'm 32, and a lot of people probably watch this program wondering why on earth does this kid have anything to say against these professors? You've heard me get irritated by it in the past. But anyway, for me, it's quite simple. I think it's wrong to commit or to pledge if you can't then follow through on said pledges. the part of the reason that there's such an anti-Western rhetoric or whatever, right? You know, a large proportion of my audience has been in the past Indian, and a lot of Indians who watch my shows are, you know, leaving this similar kind of comments, which is, you know, hypocrites. It's all that, you know, double standards. And for me, it's largely, it comes just back down to that. Unless you're able to follow through on what you're saying that you're going to do, then don't do it. Or don't say it. I think it's better, and it's not because I don't want to commit that support, right? As we've touched on many times, Sudan, Ethiopia, they are the two bloodiest conflicts of this century, more than Ukraine, more than any other one. 500,000 to 1 million people were killed in the Ethiopian civil war with Tigray in the past, from 2020 to 2022, 23. In Sudan, we've had a legitimate case of documented satellite imagery captured genocide and massacres, right, back in September, October, I'm referring to. Who's done anything? Nothing. And to Michael's point more specifically, right, when the West is talking about we need to end the wars and this, but then you follow back the supply chains, right? Who's getting the arms to Saudi Arabia that they're using in Yemen? Well, the British and the Americans. So we're talking about wanting to end the famine and the civil war within Yemen, but we're then providing the arms that is perpetrating the atrocities on both sides. So again, though, it's difficult, because if you scratch beneath the surface, there are no values, there are only interests, or whatever that expression is. So for me, I become quite pessimistic sometimes, unfortunately, because it's like, you know, the British government will talk about funding aid programs through the United Nations, through NGOs, through the World Food Programme. But then the very programs that they're funding, they've also had their own arms and missiles being used by third parties against the people that they're now providing aid to. I mean, it's business, I understand that, but like, it's just, I don't know. I don't know if I don't have an end point to what I'm saying. It's just very, very frustrating, this situation. And I think it's important that if Europe wants to sort of set its own pathway, which I do believe it can. And on this, actually, just to do some housekeeping, anyone, if you have questions, I've been saving a few, put them in the comments. If you have, you know, explicit disagreements or whatever, then do, you know, write what you see. You can see it on screen. We're all reading it as well. And, you know, we'll try and touch upon them at the end of the show.
I think James, I noticed one of the comments had said something like, I am a child of the winter and James is a child of the summer.
What the fuck does that make me then?
I don't know, but I do have to say, you know what? I was born in July. I was born in July 1977, the 1977 New York City blackout, the absolute nadir of New York's modern history, the worst day beyond the draft riots of the Civil War. So one would think that I love the heat. I hate the heat. So I absolutely love the snow. I love it when it's wintertime. So maybe I am a child of the winter.
And I have to say that I'm talking to you from where I live in Cyprus, which is stinking hot in summer. It's winter here at the moment. It was a lovely sunny day today of about 20 degrees. I love the heat. So I think there is probably something in that. Piotr, you're left out simply because I'm meant to be the optimist. Michael's the pessimist. You're the
I know someone said Piotr is the child of spring or autumn. So, you know, whatever. Okay, great.
He's the spring chicken in all of
this.
Yes,
spring chicken. Let's go with that.
The youngster in this, and we need somebody who's a bit. But I was about to say, actually, I quite, you know, we need somebody who represents the fall,
the idealist, the
autumn.
The idealist, the pessimist, and the spring chicken.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Well, you put yourself in that, because when Michael was talking about Somalia, I mean, I do remember that. I mean, it was a big time. You know, I was at university, and I remember when that was unfolding. And I still say, for anyone who, you know, Ridley Scott's Black Hawk Down is an amazing film, even now, sort of 30 years later, about that. I think
we also need to bring up this idea that, you know, Somalia took place in the 11th hour, like the waning hours of the Bush the Elder's administration, in which Clinton had inherited. But we were still, at least when I say we, I'm talking about the United States, we were still riding high from our victory from Operation Desert Storm. And so there was this understanding that we can easily go into Somalia. We can win this without any problem. I mean, for God's sake, Somalia is this, non-entity. It's even worse than Vietnam. Is no problem. We have overcome the Vietnam syndrome, and oh, look at that. What ended up happening is the Black Hawk Down syndrome. The Black Hawk Down movement was not something that was a decisive defeat for American intervention, but it reached American audiences on TV, and it killed that idea that we can just simply go in as the good guys, right, as the cavalry, and make some third world godforsaken place better. To which we had said, you know what? I mean, pardon my, Serbian, but jebiga, fuck this, I'm out of here. Which created, I think the Black Hawk Down movement was really the beginning of this understanding that we have moved from the end of history to a clash of civilizations. And this idea that Western liberalism, while still praised as morally, ideologically superior, is not given lightly and is chosen selectively, I think. And I think that ultimately what this is all being based on, is Carney's talk at the Davos Forum, and the idea that the biggest critics of liberalism have been from the neoclassical realists and from the Marxists, that say that liberalism's biggest problem is that it is not universal as much as they like to say that it is. So in this case, James and I are, on the exact page. We just take different routes to get there. Sure.
Yeah. No, but I think, this is, and I have to push back. I saw a comment from somebody who was saying, rules-based order is just a Western construct. And I actually had somebody on a channel the other day, so talking about, democracy is a Western construct. And I think, this is where I find this really disturbing, that this idea that has crept in, that somehow these values can be dismissed because they're Western imposed,
associated with the West,
rather than working it the other way around, which is to say, no, democracy is the product of a recognition of fundamental humanity. That if you accept that every human has equal rights and has equal value, then each person has the right to be heard and have a degree of autonomy over their own life. And democracy flows from that. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've got into a very disturbing situation in the world where that's reversed. That it says because democracy took hold in the West, that somehow it represents Western values, instead of looking at these universalist principles that underpin it and seeing democracy as the natural outcome of that. If you believe that people with disability have equal value, you respect that. You respect their right to have autonomy over how they control their lives as much as possible. I mean, obviously, understanding that, sometimes it can. Children have value, old people have value, women have value, and recognizing that fundamental equality that exists, and it flows from there. And I find this really disturbing now, how many people are sort of pushing back on this and sort of saying, no, democracy is a Western thing, we don't need it.
No.
I think it's also, we're talking a lot about the political or social aspect, but there's the inherent relationship of democracy to capitalism, right? And I'm not going to go into this too much because it gets a little bit too.
Christ, this conversation really has gone off in a very.
I think I can
have fun with that.
I think it's an important basis, which a foundation by which that we approach certain things, and sometimes it's important to talk about the conceptual aspects to these things. When I first studied international relations, I was always fascinated by the different international relations theories: realism, Marxism, liberalism or idealism. Constructivism was fascinating to me when I first encountered that. So anyway, the point I'm just trying to get at is that I think that right now we're seeing this debate about what kind of governance model do we want. as Trump takes a wrecking ball to a lot of American values or assets, what is he doing? He's making other countries around the world be like, well, what kind of model do we want to base our country and governance on? Do we want a democracy which has economic inconsistencies, uncertainties, because every 2 years policies change or are reversed, versus the China model, for example, which is it's a centralized single party state, but it means economic continuity, consistency, reliability, predictability, etc., etc. So is it better to have a more centralized style of governance, but means overall better economic output in theory? Or do we want to retain that more democratic values, that more individualism, all the thing, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, all these people have, theorists and thinkers of the past several hundred years sort of emphasize, right? I think this is part of the debate as well. That's where I'm sort of bringing in the capitalist element, because it's part of the political economy sort of thing. But to your other point, James, is simply that, I've said this on the program before, which is that some of the biggest proponents of democracy as we interpret it or the UN Charter are African states, because they understood that this is the hand that's been given to them, and they just have to make do with it. These arbitrary lines, statehood, right? The idea of a nation state, it has just been set upon them. But if they don't accept it, then they will continue to war indefinitely, and it'll be far much worse. So it's better to try to build an identity, a country within the borders. And that's why I think the conflict in the DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo, between also Uganda and Rwanda, is quite a big deal, because it's a demonstration of a country that experienced genocide is supporting a particular group of this, which is causing atrocities within a conflict and not sporting state borders. So there's a huge array of movements there. But anyway, I could keep talking about this.
I know it's a huge topic. I'd love to continue talking about all of it, but I understand, that obviously, maybe one for another session to delve into all of this, because I think it is so valuable. I've really enjoyed the fact that we can be, we've done this actually, because it has been a little bit more introspective and philosophical.
I think it's. I think it's, if you study international, because the thing that annoys me is that, for example, right, so we all talk about geopolitics, but what we're talking about right now is more specifically political science or international relations theories. And they're a subset or a particular framing of geopolitical events, right? And just as a point of note for people, for example, right, about a year and a half ago, in YouTube, if you have a YouTube channel, you can use hashtags in your description, and it gives you a sense of how many videos or how many channels utilize that hashtag. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that geopolitics has exploded as a niche, as an area of talk and focus on YouTube. So a year and a half ago, it was about 15,000 videos or channels, like a couple hundred maybe. Now there's 1.2 million videos on this platform which explicitly reference geopolitics. And so what I'm saying is that when we talk about geopolitics, it's but one angle, and we're talking about a lot of the theories that underpin geopolitics. And when people talk out of their ass, which unfortunately there's a number of channels that do that, they don't actually understand the depth of the academia behind it. And I think, therefore, bottom line in what I'm trying to get at is that I think it's worth having these conversations. That was a really roundabout way to say that. That's what I was trying to go.
I'd like to do more of it, precisely because I completely agree. And part of the reason I set up the channel was because, it's been going now for a number of years. But I think this is always the danger. There's a lot of people out there who will just talk and essentially
have no idea what it's based in.
Yeah. And haven't really thought it. I mean, just take latest news, and then I'm going to comment on latest news rather than actually thinking through their positions and understanding where they're coming from. And I fully accept that a lot of what I say comes across as very idealistic, but that's because I fear the world that we are moving into. And I think that it is worth preserving, for all its, flaws, the system that exists, and I think is still remarkably successful in many ways. Again, we're focusing on very serious breaches of that system. But I think the underlying system, if we get to a world where this starts to break down, where organizations like the United Nations become completely irrelevant, and I made a video very recently on, is the UN collapsing? And what is incredibly depressing.
Isn't it like
what I was about to say is what is incredibly depressing is how many people say good. Okay, just think a little bit about what that really means. Well, really think about what it means, and I think the trouble is people fixate on very certain things which matter to them and completely overlook all the other things that are going on and the value that exists in things like the United Nations. And so we can all point to the deadlock in the Security Council, but the UN does so much more than that. So to say that the world would be better without the UN, I don't even know where to begin.
People, when they talk about the UN, they're talking about the Security Council. That's all they ever think of. They're not talking about the World Food Programme. They're not talking about UNHCR.
Well, how many people really know about ECOSOC? I mean, ECOSOC is a problem in and of itself in that there is just no centrality to ECOSOC whatsoever. But you're absolutely right. When people talk about the UN, they talk about the resolutions that get vetoed at the Security Council.
Yeah.
I think that we need to also understand that in defense of the UN, 90+% of all resolutions that make it to the Security Council are passed. It's just the ones that fail are the ones that make the headlines.
And the other thing I often say to people is, the UN is absolutely vital as a diplomatic forum because, countries like United States, China can afford to have an international network of embassies, but many small countries can't. And so the UN is the one place where, you can have countries like Lesotho talking with Ecuador. They will never, ever have embassies to each other's countries. They just cannot afford. Having an international network of embassies and missions is incredibly expensive. So, but if you've got a presence at the UN, and so just even for that reason, it allows countries to be able to talk to each other. And therein lies a huge amount of value. And that's not even beginning on all the agencies and everything like that. So I do really push back on this idea that, and I think this is all part and parcel of what we're seeing. And it seems that there's a trend of two groups that seem to be pushing this idea and want to see it collapse, which is the American MAGites or MAGATs and basically Russian trolls who sort of try and say, oh, yeah, the international system, it's all a Western construct, it's all an American construct, it's sort of precisely because they want to, and this is how I'm working us way back into the Russia-Ukraine, precisely because this is the way to undermine international law and render it irrelevant so that territorial conquest can be James, not even legalized because they'll just say international law doesn't matter.
I want to piggyback off that and then let's get more towards Russia-Ukraine because we can pivot towards the peace talks in Geneva, for example. For me personally, look, I always use the example whenever I was in a recent debate on I-24, right? And the example I use is that when the NATO alliance left Afghanistan, who the hell was there to talk to the Taliban? The Russians weren't going to do it. The Chinese weren't going to do it. No country wanted to be the first to begin legitimizing the Taliban as an actual government, right? Not even the Russians. So the UN, that's the only entity there with individual political officers, of which I was one for a brief time. That's how it works. I was actually going to be positioned in Kabul when we pulled out of Kabul. So that is the unique role that the UN has. Moreover, to be honest with you, I remain relatively. The UN's not going to be in a good place, but I don't think it's going to be dissolved or collapse. Simply because we can look at NATO for this, right? Despite Trump's threats of this, despite his threats around the UN, what did he pull out of? He's pulled out the WHO. Okay, that's the biggest entity within the UN system. But he also pulled out of another 66 entities, agencies, organs, whatever.
Yes, right? Huge.
Well,
when it went uncovered, actually, in terms of news, very little reporting on it.
Well, yes and no, because if you look at the list of the 66 organizations, and I'm not saying I agree with them, he pulled out of UN Women, which has been doing incredibly important work for women's rights and leadership, but he pulled out a bunch of organizations which were pretty niche and are ultimately not going to collapse the UN. So what I think is just going to happen is that the UN, until a more pro-internationalist American president returns, I just think the UN's going to be a husk. It's going to be a husk of its former self, but I don't think it's going to disappear. Like NATO's not going to disappear. If Trump really wanted to, he would just leave NATO tomorrow, but he's not going to, because he understands the deterrent effect that it serves against the Russians and the Chinese. He doesn't need to fund it, but he doesn't have to leave it either. So they're not mutually exclusive. So I think
the UN, as you know, Piotr, I mean, it's facing huge financial squeezes.
$4 billion in debt.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean it's going to disappear.
No, it won't. It won't.
I just think it's not going to do anything. I think it's just going to be
dramatically scaled back.
It's just going to be somewhere that exists, an empty sort of.
I think. Okay, let's put this. Okay, so there's two things that we need to put into perspective. First is, let's bring this back to Russia, Ukraine, Europe, NATO, Trump. But let's.
Hello, everybody. The program begins now.
Right. It took us. It was a 55-minute introduction, but let's get on to it. Sure. But let's also talk about the madness of my country's king, Donald, first of his name. Okay? Because in many respects, I have said this on this, I've said this in this group more than once, and I say this multiple times in my class, whether it's my undergraduate or my graduate version of conflict resolution. Rule number 1, reality is dictated by the most insane person in the room. That's not an act that is 50% academic, that is 50% realistic. Reality is dictated by the most insane person in the room. May I introduce you to the madness of King Donald, who is absolutely the most insane person in the room. And everything that we are talking about now, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, rules-based order, Munich Security Conference, Davos, Israel, Palestine, Iran. Are we going to invade? Are we not? What are we going to do? Are we going to take Greenland? Are we going to invade Cuba? Are we going to make Canada the 51st state? Is all related to the musings of my mad king, who may very well face a tribunal after November, after the midterm elections. That all depends on whether my country's opposition party is a real opposition or whether it's just simply loyal opposition. And I can't help to say that the rest of the world knows this and is just simply buying time to say, let's see where we are by the end of the year. Trump is creating this, what does he call it? This peace network, what's this thing that he has now where he
Board of Peace.
What is the Board of Peace? The Board of Peace, which is kind of staffed by and made by a whole bunch of countries that have somehow managed to scrape up $1 billion each to give to Trump. I don't know
how many of them have, because I think you get 3 years free membership and then you pay $1 billion.
Yeah,
so it's basically
45. It's 46 countries.
It's an Atlantic City timeshare.
It's a 46 countries.
Basically running $1 billion timeshare.
I mean,
hold on one sec, guys. All right, yeah.
Right. No, I just want to add context. So the Board of Peace was signed in the World Economic Forum. The big players are Argentina, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan.
Saudis were there.
Saudis were there.
Let me point out.
I'm being facetious, guys. The joke is that there is no legitimate major players in it. China's not in it. Russia's not in it.
Say that, Piotr, but then what happens? The first meeting takes place a couple of days ago. Europe, having sat it out, only Hungary and Bulgaria for whatever reason, had nothing to do with it. Oh, Bulgaria, because isn't it like the CEO of it is a Bulgarian or something like that? So Bulgaria and Hungary turn up.
God.
Then they have their first meeting. And what happens? Half of Europe send bloody observers to this thing.
Did they? Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, it
didn't show up.
It doesn't have the institutional framework. It has
no. Of course, it doesn't. But the thing is, it's been legitimized in its strange little way. I thought, hopefully Europe would hold its thing. Meloni obviously decided she was going to send somebody there for Italy, and then all these other European countries. I think Germany even sent an observer.
I love the way me and Michael both take a drink at that. Like, oh Christ.
What, Meloni?
No, just my Mad King. I needed to finish the mead.
No. Just the sort of legitimization of it. Look, I think it's a joke.
I don't think it's.
Of course, it's a joke.
There's nothing legitimate about it. There is nothing legitimate about it.
But sending observers legitimizes it.
And that, okay, right? Okay. Once again, James and I have taken two completely different roads to reach the same end point. Okay, and that is the insanity of where we are right now, right? Trump is the most insane person in the room, but instead of the rest of the world acknowledging that he's the insane one, they are sending observers. They are agreeing with him. You know, we are talking about the head of state, the executive head of state that has kidnapped another head of state, blockaded another country like Cuba, is planning on turning Gaza into the next boardwalk resort, is thinking whatever mood he's in, how he's going to attack and invade Iran, has an ambassador to a particular country in the Middle East that I'm not allowed to say, that absolutely supports that country's Lebensraum, and everyone else is just simply applauding and going along with him. And that's the reason why he continues to be who he is.
I'm going to say something which seems completely bonkers now. All right, but before I came onto this, I finally started watching The Night of the Seven Kingdoms. For anyone who watches Game of Thrones and everything like that, and I just pull up because I wanted to check who was on Trump's, who'd gone along as observers, and I realised the last thing I'd been searching for was trying to piece together the relationship of all the Targaryens.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got in the Trump family, I think George R.R. Martin had written this at a time long before Trump. But my gosh, if there is a contemporary Targaryen dynasty in this world, it's the Trumps, isn't it?
I mean, you know, if we want to get
sorry, I know, complete weird tangent there for showing what I watch on a Sunday afternoon.
If we want to get pop cultural nerdy, what was it, about a week or two ago, I ended up binge watching season 1 of Andor once again. And I'm like, well, this is absolutely relevant.
Can I just give a quick shout out? If anyone, even if you're not interested in Star Wars, Andor, number of people who teach political science who have been recommending this to their students, and I am completely with them. Andor, see, it's just 2 seasons, stunningly good, and it's an amazing account told through the Star Wars. It's the serious Star Wars. It's not with Ewoks or anything like that. It's grown-up Star Wars, but it is essentially about the rise of the empire, and it is a study on the emergence of fascism, and it is incredible. It is so good, and it's right so well observed.
Right now, there are 2 PhDs that are basically telling you right here, right now, go watch Andor. But it's
seriously, and the number of serious scholars of international relations politics who are recommending this. It's an amazing series, precisely because it says so much about what we're seeing going on.
I honestly think, and I don't know, we're kind of becoming. Maybe this is the reason why we're bringing other drinks to the podcast, which probably would make us even more popular. But we are kind of becoming a little unplugged, a little acoustic right about now. But I think in many regards, this is absolutely what's necessary. It seems to be 3 idiots here. 3 absolutely fundamentally intellectual. You know what? I am more than happy to, I love the 2 of you idiots right now. Okay. Right now, the 2 of you are just
seriously, I'm with it. Oh, Daniel. Okay. Well, who's the idiot?
I mean, what can you say in this day and age? I mean, we're kind of like, I was about to say something before, Piotr, in terms of my country's foreign policy, whether it's Trump or Rubio or Vance. You have to also think about this idea that I really believe that like Vance and Rubio are making clear efforts to cement themselves as the future, although be it different versions of MAGA. People have said that MAGA is fragmenting in my country, in the United States. And I absolutely agree with that, but that does not mean that MAGA is weakening. It just simply means that MAGA is just moving, branching out into various different forms here.
No, but if you have fragmentation, that does look at what's happening in the UK now. We've just had a new political party established called Restore UK, launched by someone called Rupert Lowe. He's the guy who Musk is supporting. He's the guy who Trump prefers, because even Nigel Farage has a limit. And to be honest, if anything, I'm actually developing a little bit of respect for Farage in very particular way. No, I am, because he has a limit. He's willing to draw a line somewhere. And I think that's, you know, noteworthy. Do I like Reform as a party? No, not really. But I think it's interesting to see that someone can out Farage.
Except that Farage, look, you know, this upcoming by-election, that the candidate has been endorsed by Tommy Robinson.
No,
so I'm not sure.
No. Tommy Robinson hates Farage.
But the candidate for the Reform candidate for the upcoming election has been endorsed by Tommy Robinson.
Okay, I'll have to read into that. I don't know.
But, all
I was trying to say was simply about America, that I think it is worth considering the potential implications of a split in MAGA. Just to bring it back round to the Munich Security Conference, we said, right, Rubio's speech felt more like it was aimed at an American audience in some ways, because is he tacitly trying to position himself as a candidate for 2020?
He absolutely is. There's no question about that.
He represents more of the traditional Republican ticket, right? You've got the traditional Republicans. You've got the MAGA interventionist Republicans, i.e. Trump, and then you've got the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, what they consider to be true isolationist, MAGAs, right? I think that split is pretty big, and I think it could be a problem for the GOP in the midterms, or more specifically in the primaries and that sort of stuff. But it depends on how well the Democrats can get their act together. Because right now, who do we have? We have the left-leaning faction led by the AOC, and she was in the Munich Security Conference. And we have, of course, Gavin Newsom. And I was reading a very extensive article in the New York Times yesterday, and they ranked the Democrat candidates, and Newsom is pretty far ahead. However, there is a third person that I think could be quite noteworthy, is Pete Buttigieg. What could he do for trying to bring together the leftist faction because of his homosexual orientation and appealing to that, but also his more, shall we say, traditionalist Democrats, view to foreign policy?
I got pilloried last time we spoke about.
I rolled my eyes. I rolled my eyes for Piotr. Now I rolled my eyes for you the previous time.
Why'd you roll your eyes?
I mean, as far as the left is concerned, the left has no love at all for petit bourgeois. Okay,
okay, fair
petit
enough. But as I said last time, his knowledge of policy. I tell you who I did speak, actually. I did listen to speak the other day, who was really impressive. And I would also put this is one to watch, if not for the next election, for the future, is John Ossoff, who's a senator. And
can you elaborate for the audience? Who's that? I'm not familiar with it.
I hadn't heard of him until recently. I mean, he's a senator. I'm just looking up. He's very young. He's like 39 years old. He's senior U.S. senator for Georgia. So a Democrat, with
in a GOP traditional state. Interesting.
Exactly. And look up some of his recent speeches, and this is somebody who really, really is impressive when he talks. And so much of politics is obviously about that. I know people sort of bemoan that it's sort of very shallow and stuff like that. I get a sense there is more to him, but it'd be interesting to see. But this is one to watch, because often what happens in this is you've got these big names who are so utterly divisive that they can't pull together the wings, and then sometimes that just allows these rather interesting characters to come from nowhere and sort of sneak through the middle. And he'd be one to watch from what I've seen.
I think the primary need of the Democrats is not more candidates, but to solidify, to develop a united front and have a clearly defined set of people who are at the front of that, but working together. Because right now you have individual voices which sort of say overlapping things occasionally, but there's not enough coordination between them. As far as I can see right now, and this isn't an endorsement, it's just an acknowledgement of the reality, which is that Newsom seems to be leading AOC, I think, is second in the polls. I'm not sure who's third. But, Gavin Newsom is really trying to position himself. And he made that very clear at the security conference, by saying America will return. He's trying to play fire with fire by taking on MAGA, by when the MAGA, what was it, the Trump administration, they were trying to redraw some of the electoral lines and some of the constituents in some states in the US. And so what did Gavin Newsom do? He redrew the lines in certain parts of California so that the same amount of electoral votes was available in, I can't remember whatever it was, not the electoral college, but one of the subsets. So he's playing the game like them. And I think he's trying to do that with the long-term inclination of trying to be the head of the, opposition. Michael, I don't know if you would agree with that sort of interpretation, but again, I'm not saying Gavin Newsom's my favorite person, but he seems to be.
Newsom is being, touted as the front runner right now. It ultimately depends on what the DNC ultimately decides. You go into a restaurant, you order a Coke, and the waiter or waitress basically looks at you and says, "Is Pepsi okay?" And you're like, "Yeah, okay, fine." And that's how the DNC operates. It's difficult, it's difficult to really gauge as to where the presidential elections are going to go. Right now, the midterm elections may very well go.
It's going to be a disaster for Trump. Come on.
It will be, which is the reason why I think a lot of, if we can bring this back to geopolitical stuff, I think a lot of other countries are just simply running the clock out until the end of the year, right? That's the thing that, let's do a couple of things. Let's focus on midterm elections, and then we'll focus on presidential. Provided that Trump steps down. Provided that two things. Number one, Trump steps down at the end of his term, or he lives to the end of his term, because there's a lot of, elements.
Why would he not?
See, Piotr, you said this last time.
I know I did.
He's not healthy. He's not healthy. But the
seriously,
it's not as bad as Biden.
The thing is
everyone's reporting on this.
What you don't want is a Vance presidency.
No, I fucking don't. Sorry, everyone.
Don't want. Look, every so often we need to slip into Serbian. It's okay. You don't want a Vance presidency. You don't want a Rubio presidency. You don't want. They are all basically building on the charisma of Trump's impending funeral to position themselves as the next front runner for the, for U.S. leadership.
Rubio's quite far down in the line of succession, though, isn't he?
What's that you said, James? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm just looking at the US line of succession. Rubio's quite far down.
Unless he runs and wins, but I don't think he will.
No, again, but I'm saying if
you're wrong. I mean,
if something happens tomorrow.
Okay, so you have Vance as vice president, and he's doing
then it's Mike Johnson. Lucky you.
Heaven help us.
Chuck Grassley comes in at third, and then fourth is Rubio.
I mean, look, I've long thought about this.
Pete Hegseth's in sixth. If you really want to sleep,
Hegseth is going to just basically stumble and fumble his way back to Fox News.
Pam Bondi at 7. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt on just a few of these. Robert Kennedy in 12th. So, because there's obviously a lot of discussion about lines of succession in the UK at the moment. So it's quite fun to see. And Christy Noam comes in at 18th.
As the only true American in this three-way conversation here, a lot of times I'm asked by people, what do you make of your country in the terms of, and I'm like, go watch Idiocracy, and it's not a comedy, it's a documentary. It's like I have to say, and this is just me saying this right here, right now. My country has a long history of being run by mediocre idiots. But I don't think that we have had as much of a collective gaggle of mediocre, mid-level idiots running the country as much as we have had in recent memory. That's the big thing. And I say that not as an anti-Republican and a pro-Democrat, because I have little faith in really any political party right now realizing what needs to be done. You know, we can have a separate conversation about this, is that, you know, how is the United States dealing with its declining leadership in an age of rising multipolarity, when we are one of the last countries in the world that still wants to believe and enforce that we're still a unipolar power? We're not. We're absolutely not.
Well, I mean,
we still have the ability. We still have the ability to do a lot of damage. We still have the ability to engage a lot of influence. I'm gonna throw out another, obscure academic reference, but after the Byzantine restoration of Constantinople in 1261, the empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, had basically another 200 years or so of relevancy. We were still, the Byzantium was still able to engage in the Sicilian Vespers.
Look, I think that
the Americans, 1453,
we can still do a lot of influence, not to the best of our abilities. And I'm not saying that the country is declining, but what I am saying is that our leadership is absolutely stuck in this delusional belief that we can somehow reverse all of this and still be the world leaders without anyone else.
I think it depends. World leadership is only as legitimate as other countries give it legitimacy. But on the other hand, what the Americans did in absolute resolve was remarkable. No other country can do what happened in Venezuela, but it was also a snatch and grab operation.
I need to just mention right here, one of the comments. Wow, an American comparing themselves to Byzantium is a stretch. You're absolutely right. I absolutely apologize. We are nowhere near as awesome as Byzantium ever could possibly be. So yes, I agree with you. Anyways.
I don't know what we're talking about anymore.
It's nerdy. I'm engaging with the comment. It's just a nerdy.
I'm joking.
You're absolutely right. I wish that we could be the Paleologian restoration, but we're not. Okay.
No, I was just trying to bring it to recent, the build up to Iran, right? I think the major next geopolitical hotspot is obviously the build up to Iran, but in what capacity and how far? But again, no country can do what the Americans are doing right now in the Middle East. For better or for worse, they can't. The Chinese have 2 military bases. The Americans have 800. It's a bit of a different, kettle of fish. What I think is interesting is that the British government have rejected or denied American usage of their bases, which shows you, is that an ideological divergence there on the eyes of the British, that they think that this operation, if it does happen, is a quagmire for the Americans, that they're going to get stuck in Iran, it's going to be Trump's Afghanistan. It's interesting because clearly the British don't want a long, drawn-out, protracted conflict. They want a limited operation, and Trump doesn't have that in his mind. But I think that's very interesting. And just to bring it back to the American conversation, the reason I keep wondering about Trump's health is simply because it's not as lauded all over the media as it is as Biden was. I rarely see it as the primary headline. Maybe that's because of the obsession over Jeffrey Epstein files, but I just don't see as much emphasis on Trump's health and mental state. I mean,
no, it's not. That's the thing. But it's been very, very openly talked about by a lot of people. But it isn't obviously being talked about in, and I hate this term, mainstream media. And it is interesting how. But that is an entirely different debate, on sort of how, unfortunately, sort of media works in the United States and the UK at the moment. Because it's the same with, they look how much is neglected in British media. That isn't there, that anyone who follows British politics knows it should be screamed about by sort of media outlets and things like that. But when you've still got it controlled essentially by a lot of the Well, no, I could get into a very, very.
No, but I think that's fair. Let's bring it back to Ukraine and NATO. Welcome everyone to the stream. Thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about Ukraine, Russia, and NATO. If you saw a group of people talking about lots of eclectic other things earlier, that definitely wasn't us.
But can I just jump in and say, part of the reason I think we ended up talking about other things was because fairly quickly we worked out that there isn't a lot that seems to be developing. I mean, militarily, diplomatically, politically, it seems to be stuck.
No,
and then
James,
we got into this sort of debate and discussion about
the Russians are negotiating. We're having peace talks in Geneva. That's big diplomatic movements. No, I do think there's one notable aspect from that, which is they are the first diplomatic talks that have happened in Europe since the war fully took off. And whether or not it means anything other than symbolism, perhaps, but I think it's worth considering that they are the first in the 4-year period. And I also think it's interesting to consider the fact that the Russians are making these willing steps to sort of join in Geneva, and sort of that the Ukrainians are talking about elections. I think those are probably the two main elements. For me, the biggest movement is in Russia's economy and Ukraine's domestic situation with these election suggestions. I think those are probably the two.
I mean, Piotr, can I come in on this? Because, I
made
a video on... No, I want to ask you a question because I know you made a video on this. But I mean, I think we've been hearing so much for so long from sort of saying the Russian economy is on the brink of collapse, that it just can't sustain this any longer. And here we are 4 years later, and but you seem to think that something has now changed. Where do you see it going then?
Well, I'm gonna do a little bit of shameless dropping actually, but on Tuesday morning, if anyone's interested, at about 8:30, 9 o'clock British time, I will be on Sky News in the studio for the first time. So if you're in England and you watch Sky News, put on the breakfast show and you'll see me in the studio, which is cool. But I'll be talking about this. I think it depends on a few different things, and the only reason I'm flagging that is because it's a big deal. I've never had anything like that before. It's quite exciting. So anyway,
good fun. Nice.
No, it's just because James, you've had the opportunity to do it. Michael, you've had the opportunity to do it. So it's pretty crazy when you get.
Their studio's still in Twickenham, by the way.
No, it's
it was over in West London.
No, it's in Central London.
Oh gosh! All right, okay.
No, it's in Westminster.
Okay. So you're going into that studio, not the main sort of headquarters that used to be over in West London.
No, it's the breakfast time show that they launched about 4 or 5 months ago, but it's a big deal, obviously, because it's the 4th anniversary. And for some reason they want me to come, or not someone actually of legitimate knowledge. But still, what I am getting at is that I think that there are quite a few individual components, metrics that are beginning to demonstrate a real pressure cooker. The Russian economy is overheating, and the capacity for the Russian central bank or other, I don't know, I'll break it down more specifically, right? So in the fiscal side, the Russians are running out of revenue. Their ability to leverage government funding is incredibly low. They are paying out huge arrays of salaries to soldiers, to families, those who have lost soldiers to the war. And so they're having to raise taxes. They're having to cut expenditure on public services. And then there's the monetary policy. We've seen the metric that pro-Russian or Putin voices like to use is that the Russian ruble is doing really well. But that's doing really well because the economy is being artificially inflated by the expenditure of the government into the military industries, which, as we know, doesn't have a long shelf life because there's no positive feedback loop. If you're spending your money on military equipment, which is then destroyed, how does that have a trickle-down effect for other industries and consumerism and stuff? So the monetary, so interest rates are quite high, and generally the central bank
pay taxes, in other words.
No, and the central bank has effectively utilized every single mechanism tool that it can at this point. And the third one is trade policy. Russian exports of oil are now at $35 a barrel. Now, the State Duma had put their plan, their 2-year or whatever, 2-3-year economic spending plan on the basis that the oil prices would be at least, or they'd be selling oil at around $60 to $70 a barrel. So we're literally talking almost half that. Now, I have some insider chats with people on the ground who tell me that in some cases, the Russians are actually selling oil to certain people or groups at $25 a barrel. This is not sustainable. And the minute that the Trump administration threatened secondary sanctions on China and India, we saw very quickly how quickly they were reducing or reconsidering their consumption. So it's this trifecta of events, not to mention that the fact that the Russian inner circle, so oligarchs, are buying gold when the Russian government is selling it by a lot. So what are they doing? They're hedging against their own government. So do I think that the Russian economy is in an imminent collapse? No, but I do think it's coming to a head. And I think that Putin is very well aware of that. But the problem is, and I'll end with this point on this monologue, is simply that the Russian economy is now dependent on the war. So Putin can't end the war because it's what drives production of resources. It's what is paying soldiers. It's what keeps people supporting him. So I really think it's getting pretty bad. Does it mean it's going to collapse tomorrow, as some other people that I engage with, but have their entire channels based around this, and every other channel video is imminent collapse? No. Of course, the Russians are very good at resilience. They're very good at innovating ways around things. And as one person said to me just last week, the Russians are known as professional sufferers because of what they've been through with the past, 70, 100 years. They're very good at endurance and enduring hardship. So for better or for worse. So no, I don't think, to be honest with you, I really don't think much is going to happen this year with the war in Ukraine. I think we're going to go round and round with these peace talks. I think there's going to be some movements on the battlefield, but very minor. And I think the main thing is going to be strategic, that the Europeans are going to continue to independently develop their own capacity to support Ukraine, take the steps which is going to anger Putin. And I think you might see Putin putting more and more provocation on the Europeans, as we saw in August, September.
No, I think that's a real danger, isn't it?
Anyway, I spoke for a long time there.
So but it's important because
that's fall. Yeah,
I think that there has been so much conflicting information about this, and obviously, you can't go on what's been said online for all sorts of reasons. Not us notwithstanding. I mean, seriously, there have been, there've been all these sort of things, Russian imminent collapse, and then obviously you have all the sort of the pro-Russian voices saying, no, it's just made up. The economy is just booming and doing brilliantly, and. But there was a comment which I thought was quite interesting, which was that Russia's going nowhere. They haven't even adopted, full-scale conscription yet, as though, that can suddenly,
Haven't done full conscription. Yeah. What about the 500,000 from September 2022? Or was that just cash?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that has often been made is it's one thing, isn't it, when you're drafting troops from outlying districts, but it's something very different when
it's beginning to. That's the other thing.
This is. I just want to say
the urban centers
really needs to be given a separate issue. Yeah.
Sorry, Michael. What was that?
I was about to say this whole idea when Putin had talked about partial mobilization. I can tell you, right, I was living and working in Tashkent, Uzbekistan at the time. Central Asia had experienced an influx of Russian families into the region at that time. So that in and of itself tells you the limits of what Putin can and cannot do. So that's just something I just want to say is, should be reserved for another subject.
No,
no, but I mean, and then good old left-wing nationalists saying this is such cope, lol.
What's cope?
For some reason, it's sort of like, we're talking down Russia, and obviously,
I
sort of
see,
seems to be our Russian fanboy, if not troll. Hello, left-wing nationalist, I love you, really.
I think it's very just. I think
you know what we need to do. Okay, you know what we also need to do is kind of put Russia's actual functionality, its capacity, into actual empirical perspective here.
Yeah.
And a large part of this is that the ideology of Russian foreign policy today, and this is not me saying this is not anyone else, this is Putin, Lavrov, these are the two people that matter that are saying this, right? Is that Russia is a major emerging power in a new multipolar world, but it is at best number 3 behind China and the United States.
I'm not by. I did a video on this recently. I'll try and remember to put a link up to
James,
it.
I love you.
I'm not so sure Russia meets the criteria of great power anymore.
On this, and you did a solo video on this. We could have absolutely have had a two-way.
We'll come back for that, ding dong, Michael. I know we said we were going to talk about it, but I felt I needed to sort of have a real good think to myself about it. And so anyway, I did this video.
What I would like to do actually is, yes, do this, people. Whichever channel you're on, do like and subscribe, and remember to support us, because I think we do a good job of being pretty balanced with each other. But no, I would genuinely like to do this, which is, you're hearing it now, everyone, live. What I would like to do is, I'd like to have these guys in person, and then I can just step back and be moderator, legit moderator, and these two have a proper debate about Russian or whatever it is, big power status or something. I think that would be really interesting to do. Anyway, sorry, go on, guys.
One thing that did come out, and I know that there is a sense that sometimes, when you listen to people talk on YouTube, or it's a question of talking at and not having a conversation. But that video I did on Russia as a great power actually really, really helped crystallize my thoughts. Not the video itself, but the comments and the discussions I was having underneath, because a number of people who came back and said, but Russia's got all the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. And it really got me thinking, do nuclear weapons make a country a great power? And clearly not. It means that you won't get invaded, that much is for sure. But it's next to useless as a tool of, policy. Has having a massive nuclear arsenal prevented sanctions on Russia? No. Has it stopped, has it unfrozen Russian assets? No. Has it won them the war in Ukraine? No. It just means that NATO is not going to invade Russia, and no one else is going to invade Russia. So I think, in many ways, it was a really interesting debate to have, because I think nuclear weapons, I don't see nuclear weapons now as a tool of a great power. It's something else, but a great power is one that can influence other countries and have a say, and nuclear weapons can't do that. So that's just a little bit of a say, I know when people sort of think that sometimes when we're speaking it's really not like that. It's actually these conversations that we have with, viewers really do, certainly in my case, help to crystallize my thoughts enormously. So thank you to everyone who actually engages and in serious ways in the comment section. And I'm really pleased to say.
So I want to ask you both a question, or sort of float this notion, right? So, people love to rank things and put things into categories, into boxes. And I think it's pretty clear that there are two front runners when we're talking about the great powers, superpowers, big powers, right? I tend to differentiate between great powers or big powers these days, because I don't think there's anything great about what Moscow does in Ukraine. However, would we be fair in saying that if we want to rank countries based on their global influence, it's about the ability to project power? Because for me, the Russians still have a capacity to project power in a way that, if America's first, China's second, okay, who is third? Well, Russia's definitely in the top 10. what about Japan then? Is Japan number 3 instead of Russia? Like literally, let's list out the countries. For me, it comes to Japan, Germany. Well, they don't have nukes though. France, no. England or UK, Russia, India. I don't, what list of what group of countries are we actually going to pick from?
This is where it gets incredibly complicated. I think somebody actually put it in a really nice way, and I, for anyone, please, I'm really giving a plug to the video, but somebody put it rather nicely that Russia is a regional power that neighbors many regions, which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it. But I'm very skeptical now of, and in all sorts of ways. I mean, and this has gone back a few years. So Kosovo, and God, because no live stream is complete without us bringing that dreaded situation into it. But one of the things that really stood out was that when Western countries led by the United States recognized Kosovo, the number of countries they managed to get to line up behind them was quite significant. Not as significant as one would expect, given them their supposed power on the world stage. Only about 50% of UN members recognize Kosovo. But what was very telling is that when Russia recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia and went on the same diplomatic push around the world to get countries to line up behind it, I think it only got 6, and 3 of those were South Pacific nations, which it had given sort of massive payoffs to. So even then, you could see that its diplomatic status and its power, its ability to project on what was a very significant national interest for Russia, in the same way that Kosovo, because this becomes a measure of significance. And sorry, I'm just a bit of a tangent, but it was a really interesting. I remember talking about this, because Britain, France, United States were pushing very heavily for Kosovo recognition. They stopped after about 5 years. And I remember one official telling me, when I asked them, why did you stop? They said, because it was becoming embarrassing. Because when you go in, there's only so many times you can ask a Caribbean island state, please recognize Kosovo. And when it doesn't, it shows up your weakness.
Yeah.
So this
but Kosovo's on the peace council, whatever the hell.
Yeah, that was standing. But the point I was making was
Osmanli is right there doing her.
Yeah, I saw and things. Interestingly, Serbia didn't send even to the observer, which was quite interesting. Which was very telling for me.
Serbia has got better thing to do with $1 billion. Kosovo.
No, but I'm even saying for the freebies, for the freebie observers. But the point I think I'm trying to make is that power is absolutely about the ability to influence others economically, politically, diplomatically, militarily even. And, it is a very, very interesting time for which are the emerging and in what areas?
Because I think that, as far as the philosophy of Russian foreign policy is concerned, I don't believe, unless, I'm missing some document that I haven't read, I don't believe that Russia has ever positioned itself to be some kind of moral influencer in the world. In that Russia's foreign policy has always been that it positions itself within the realities of a multipolar world, of which, and this is according to both Putin and Lavrov, that Russia is at best number 3. The United States is going to still be regarded as number 1 as far as Russia's leadership is concerned. China is number 2, and you ask, where is number 3? There is a distant number 3. There is a distant number 3, and that is Russia.
It's
but
not.
To say that,
who is it?
What is it?
Who is it then?
Number 3?
Russia, is it?
It is. I would regard Russia as
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we are.
I would say
we can talk a bit.
The United States is number 1, but it's losing its leverage as number 1. China is the rising number 2. And then there's just a major, gap between number 3 and then number 4, number 5. I mean, we can, kind of.
I don't think I'm actually starting to think, can we even rank it in that way? I think we're maybe moving to an odd form of. You've got 2 superpowers in Russia, in the United States and China. I think we're seeing a rise of a lot of regional powers. The European Union is a really interesting one because that has all the makings of having been a power bloc
Well, I think that's fair. We're looking
taking a leadership. And Piotr, you were talking about the Mercosur agreement, and I think that the European Union's great value going ahead is coming back to this idea of saying, look, we aren't a single country. We are a group of countries that recognize the value of working with each other. And that model is one that...
Yeah, no, I have to intervene on one thing. I've got somebody in the comments section that is constantly asking me to equate...
I was going to raise that. I was going to raise that at the end, Michael.
Okay. Do not besmirch the good name of Belisarius with Pete Hegseth. Belisarius is untouchable. Belisarius you want to know why there is this YouTube channel? This guy, I forget, he's from Iran. He does all of this great music, and one of the most important videos is the song that he made to Belisarius, because Belisarius is fucking awesome. Pete Hegseth is an alcoholic. Do not compare Belisarius with Pete Hegseth.
We are
exactly what I'm talking about.
Belisarius is I don't think anyone seriously wants to compare Belisarius with
Roman Empire. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
We're definitely on
all respect to Belisarius right here, right now. Renovato Imperium. Okay,
we're definitely more in an unhinged version of the show.
And that 90% of the audience were like, "What the hell is he getting himself into right now?" I'm just like, no, I have to make this very clear right now. Belisarius is awesome. Do not besmirch Belisarius with Pete Hegseth.
But to be clear, so to sort of wrap this point up, I think that. I think what is interesting is that we're coming at this from the presumption of nation state, right? That the most powerful entities in the world are all countries, but clearly, and it goes back to the theory side of stuff that we were sort of touching upon before, which is that we're in a world where the nation state is not the only actor anymore. Non-state actors. Look at what ISIS did in the few years of the 2010s, right? Or what the EU represents. It's not a nation state; it's a supranational organization. And they do wield a lot of power. I think one of the biggest considerations for this year is how far is the European Union going to continue along the line that perhaps the greater integration is necessary. And this points me to a video that I'm working on, which is simply that some of the biggest anti-European voices in the past few years, more right-leaning populists like Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni in her own way, Polish people like the Law and Justice Party, they are now beginning to reframe their arguments, not necessarily in favor, but in acceptance or recognition of the idea of greater federalism, simply because Trump's approach towards European interests is so grave that they're like, maybe we need a form of a federal Europe. And this is coming from groups of people that have always been hugely emphasis on nationalism. And I think that's really, really interesting. Anyway, bottom line I'm trying to make is that certainly if you want to include non-nation state entities, then yeah, the European Union is absolutely number 3, possibly number 2, depending upon how you define it. But, then we talk about what is Mercosur, a collective entity? What about ASEAN? What about this Islamic NATO that's been floated, or this new thing that Bangladesh is trying to push with Pakistan? There's lots of different, ways that we could, but, so for me, or the other option is simply that Trump's unpredictability and for countries like South Korea or Japan to be able to believe that they can rely on security assurances from the United States, what are they considering? They're considering getting nuclear weapons. So if Japan suddenly gets nuclear weapons, well, they're an economic powerhouse and now they're nuclear armed. Well, then by technically our relatively crude set of definitions, maybe they're number 3 now. But I agree that there's obviously a large gap between number 2 and 1 and number 3. But I think for me,
I come back again. I really am sort of I think we take it as given that having nuclear weapons confers some sort of power status. And I'm not. No, I really am. The more I think about this, I think it does something, but it doesn't confer power status. It just means you don't get invaded. I keep coming back to this point. You cannot use them. We're not in a world where it becomes a tool of power projection in any way. Russia is the overwhelming. It has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It has not been able to beat Ukraine. So it's not at all a power of projection.
No, but it's also very good at intimidating enough that NATO doesn't want to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine for fear of nuclear weapons.
Escalating it up.
That was a good rebuttal.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, but I just don't think it achieves policy goals.
No,
in
it
the way
doesn't.
that,
Of course it doesn't. It's purely symbolic.
Unless the country is absolutely engaging in power projection. Russia is not. China is not. The only country engaging in power projection right now is the United States.
Oh, well, I'm not sure I agree with China not engaging in power projection, Michael.
What are the Chinese doing?
Explain. What are we talking about? Are we talking about soft power? Are we talking about hard power? What are we talking about?
Economic power.
Economic power. You know what? Nobody complains. I mean, you know what? I'll stop right there. But still, I'm just like, I don't recall, unless I'm talking about a small peripheral country in Central Southern Asia, as bemoaning their economic takeover by the Chinese.
But that doesn't mean, in many ways, that sort of rather confirms, doesn't it, that China has been very, very effective in leveraging its economic strength as a tool of power projection.
Still, it's a counterbalance against the United States. You know, so you have to think. But this is I like how you frame this, because what you're talking about is the video that we never had, and that was what defines a great power, right? What defines a great power in this day and age? Are we talking about hard power, soft power, military power, economic leverage? Which other countries are absolutely adamant about swaying governments towards being compliant towards their own home rule? You could look at Russia as a way of trying to colonize Ukraine. But then again, Ukraine is effectively been in a proxy war between the West and the East over who gets to control over who gets control over Kiev. Does that disqualify Russia as a great power? I mean, that is an interesting question.
Oh God! And we've got the comment here that comes up time and time again, which is, "Oh, Russia would have beaten Ukraine had it not been for the West going in on their side." Well, you know, you can't. That's the way the world works. I never got that argument. Can somebody explain it to me?
The West didn't go in
which I can see this. And again, I don't have. But my guess is that within 2-3 weeks after Russia's incursion into Ukraine, we had the Istanbul meetings between Ukrainian and Russian sides, and your respective current or president or whatever, Boris Johnson. You know, he looks like a bit player on Only Fools and Horses, decides to show up and say, keep fighting. I'm sorry, I have to say, Boris Johnson has one immutable quality behind him. And that is, his quality is he is absolutely incapable of looking like anything other than the local pub plonker of any village that he shows up to. I mean, that's just me. I mean, the guy just has absolutely
but can I? So I'll just jump in on this. So,
but to his credit, he shows up and he says to Ukraine, "Keep fighting, keep fighting."
I will say that. I'm not sure. I mean, that has been
live out to another day.
That's been challenged and debunked. One thing I will say, as somebody who in a previous incarnation, I ended up spending a morning with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary.
And Boris Johnson, that sounds absolutely horrible.
And no, what I would say, it made me realize what made him so very dangerous, is that this is somebody who both intentionally and unintentionally was one of the funniest people I'd ever met. And that you realize was his great skill, that he would, and there would you'd hear stories that he'd be out for his run in the morning. Somebody across the street would shout out across the road, "Oi, Boris, you wanker." 10 minutes later, there they are, arms around each other, taking a selfie. It really was phenomenal to see. And you realize how he managed but as everyone pointed out, he made everyone think that they were special until he stabbed them in the back. But that was an amazing, it was truly, met enough politicians in my time to sort of know, and see what makes them the ones who are really effective, and the ones who are most effective are the ones who, when you're with them, they have this unbelievable ability to make you think that you are the most important person in the world. That you are the one person they need to get their views over to and understand. And that is an amazing quality. And, that makes these politicians very, very effective in what they want to do personally. Not great for society in all sorts of ways, as you can imagine. But this was it was so telling. And I hadn't realized, as I say, until I had that experience, And I remember coming back thinking, now I understand it. Now I get it as to how many people line up behind him and think that he's great. Not that I thought that he was great, I have to say, but it all fell into place when I had that experience of, as I say, of being up close.
Can I just say one quick comment, which is you guys need to take a deep breath and a drink. I mean, I've been drinking whiskey since we started, so intertwined with water. But what I would say is actually this is a little bit, as we approach the 2-hour mark, maybe we should begin to wind down. But I think this has been really fun. Maybe we should do more sort of late night shows instead, because I think we have a bit more of a natural flow, because obviously it was so bad before. But I don't know. I mean, I think this is quite fun.
Can I just say, to not much to be fair 126, or not much to meets a real politician rather than a technocrat politician. No, I've met a lot of real politicians in my time. That's why exactly I was able to immediately see that, where Johnson fell in. But he was really at the peak of his game. Back then, as being one of these people who was able, and he really, it was. There are other people. I mean, I can name sort of other politicians, but it probably won't mean a lot. But sort of in the Balkans and things over the years as well, who I've seen who've got that amazing ability. By the way, for anyone who's interested in Cyprus, who might be watching, Ralph Denktash was exactly the same. Denktash had this amazing ability. This legendary Turkish Cypriot leader. When you were with him, you were the one person in the world he needed to explain the Cyprus problem and his perspective.
Oh, you want to talk about Balkan politicians and charisma and taking to the kafana to drink? I mean, pick your former Yugoslav republic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is the thing when you meet these, and that is exactly, Piotr, what you were bringing. Farage. This is Farage's great ability, completely self-serving, but for some reason, he connects with people, and people think that he's just like them, and he makes them feel important and special.
That's precisely why, when I said I respect him, you winced.
Yeah, because I wouldn't ever use the word respect. I'd sort of recognize his fiendish abilities, but
but that's the thing, right? I take this from
I know where you're coming from, but it's just the thought of it.
No, but I respect Farage.
Can I just quickly also say, for anyone who wants a little bit of comedy gold, somebody a few years ago when he was hosting on LBC, Piotr, I don't know if you saw this clip of when he was hosting his radio show on LBC, and somebody called in and
he got hit.
Said,
yeah, I know.
Yeah, that the one, and it was one of the funniest things. Just to I don't even know how to give it. Yeah, kicked in the head by a horse. Give away the punchline, but it was so funny. They walked Farage into that joke.
No, look, I just to clarify my position, I find Farage insufferable because the very first thing he did when he realized that Brexit was happening, he flew to Germany and he got his German citizenship. The very same day he flew there, and the next day he had German citizenship, because he never expected Brexit to happen. And why was he not wanting Brexit to happen? Because a large proportion of his entire brand, his entire marketing strategy was based on the leadership of the UKIP, or UK Independence Party. And so suddenly the UK is independent of the EU. What on earth does he have left to run on? I mean, since then he's obviously developed workarounds and appealing provision. He's worked on the fallout of Brexit and how bad it's gone for illegal immigration and all that. And that's where I respect him, because he's good at playing the system. Do I like him? No, but you can't deny his tenacity to be a good political player.
Yeah. So I just have to jump in and say somebody asked us to get back onto Ukraine, Russia.
No, I understand.
I will say,
you know what?
Again, we've tried it twice.
A final 10 minutes.
We wanted to talk about it, but the reality is, we could sit here and talk and speculate, but the reality is we've got very little hard information at the moment. And I think that we are at this point where it is 4 years now. I think we were all expecting maybe we could have got into, but it would have been, we tried twice now to get back to it, but there isn't a lot to be said at the moment. That's the reality.
Well, someone wrote in the comments, this one who is exasperated with our conversation.
That's what I was about to say. Can we do the last 5-10 minutes of getting
okay, so where do we think it's going? I mean, I already outlined my position.
I think that, ultimately, I maybe you will disagree with me, but we came up to this in the beginning, and that is that we are nowhere right now. We're still at an impasse. Neither side has any leverage to really impose on the other. Within the model of negotiated settlements to a conflict, Russia does not have the leverage yet to demand all of what it wants. Ukraine has, I'm sorry to say, in the words of J.D. Vance, no cards to play at the moment. But yet Ukraine, in the words of the opening stanza of its anthem, is not yet dead. Ukraine is still alive. Ukraine still has enough to sustain itself, at least for the next 2 weeks, if not for the next 2 years. And so if the Geneva talks have failed, and elements within the Ukrainian government are now saying that we need to prepare ourselves for the next 2 to 3 years of a sustained war in which we will reverse all of our losses, then in that regard, any attempt at a negotiated settlement is a moot point, at this point. So, yeah, I know this is what James and I do.
James, do you want to fulfill this prophecy?
I love this. I love this idea. I love that at the end of the day, we take 2 different routes, but we end up at the same bar at the end of the day.
And I think a lot of people would say, well, that is actually, a sign that we're right. We can come at very different positions and end up in the same place.
I have a very hard time disagreeing.
Maybe our end up.
I have a hard time disagreeing with him. He's more idealistic than I am, but at the end of the day, we've both read E.H. Carr, so I get it.
But I think, certainly, if you go with traditional things, so you would say that a precondition of peace agreements is when you end up in what we call a hurting stalemate. So,
yes,
very often you will end up in a situation where 2 sides can be in conflict with each other, but they can live with it ultimately. And there is very little incentive to solve it because they think, right, okay, we can live with it. Why give up our position now to take a deal that we don't want? We can sit on it and it's not. So the real question is, are Russia and Ukraine in a hurting stalemate? And in many ways, one would have to say, yes, they are. So what seems to be, the deadlock here? And I think that it then becomes a very interesting factor of when you start to consider sort of how do you get people to climb down from positions, because they've created very, very clear sort of red lines on this that they can't step back from. I think also the other point that Piotr, you raised about the economy is incredibly important in all of this, that Putin through this war has effectively now created a conflict that he can't walk away from, that the whole country is geared towards it now, especially economically. So even if this is hurting, then, the consequences of walking away would be even more painful.
He has no choice.
Yeah. So essentially, we end up in a very, very interesting situation that this is a hurting stalemate, but it's a war that can't end. It can end, but it's going to, it'll probably mean, the end of Putin and another leader who's willing to come in and level with the Russian people and say, look, this is the mess that we've got ourselves into.
No, look, from my perspective,
that's another topic.
Yeah, no, but I fully accept that, and I know, from people who follow Russian politics a lot more sort of closely, they're saying, well, this is a situation we often get into. We think, right, okay, get rid of the bad leader and you're going to get somebody good. And that simply isn't the case.
Not going to happen.
It can happen that way, but very often it won't. So
it won't.
From my perspective, look, I also think about this from a content side, right? Not because I want to be known as someone who covers the war purely, but like there are people who have framed their entire channels around every single niche development that occurs within the war in Ukraine. But ultimately, they're very minute, granular details in the overall strategic bigger picture of what my channel is about. Are those minute details going to make a difference in the ultimate outcome of this conflict? Of course not. And I saw a video earlier today just suggested to me by the Daily Mail, who's next after Putin? How many years have we been asking this question? I remember it before the war in Ukraine was fully took off, if you like, in 2022, right? I think it was in 2021. There was a discussion around, Putin's mindset, his mental state is looking very precarious. The guy's doing pretty all right. What I find frustrating is that people. No, you can rebuttal anything I say, Michael, in a second.
No, go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
What I find frustrating is that there's a lot of, and this is why I do use the word cope, people who want Ukraine to win, sure, but latch onto anything that gives a sense of false hope. Putin does not have doubles. He is not being killed. And he's not in a double, like when he appears in fatigues, that's not a Putin double, okay? Does he have people who maybe, I don't know, perhaps, but that is unequivocally pro-Ukrainian or unrealistic propaganda, right? Propaganda exists on both sides, and people don't like me saying this because it makes people think that I'm being pro-Russian. So it's like, no, you have to understand that information warfare applies both sides. When Zelensky says that 55,000 Ukrainians have been killed in this war, that's a flat-out lie. It's much more than that, guys. It's at least double, probably. British and American intelligence, for what it's worth, which is pretty good because they both accurately predicted when the war is going to happen in January of 2022, have said that the Ukrainian fatalities, not casualties, is upwards of 120,000. The Russians, it's 200,000. The Russians don't care, or whatever. The Soviet doctrine that defines Russian military operations does not give a shit about human life. We know this. Scorched earth policy, meat grinder tactics, that sort of thing, right? Throw as many bodies at the problem as you can. So anyway, bottom line is, though, with all these horrible details, the war is not going to change this year. They're going to continue a stalemate, right? I asked Ben Hodges this just over the weekend, or whatever, on Friday. Are we going to see a spring offensive? And he lost it. Well, he didn't lose his mind, but he's like, oh, not another mention of spring offensive, right? How many times have we seen in the past 4 years the idea, the incoming spring offensive by either side, and then it never materializes? It's nothing's going to change. The only big thing to change is how much Europe deviates away from America, how much Trump threatens more sanctions on Russia or more defunding of Ukraine support. Those are the things to watch. It's not whether or not another hay bale is taken, or whether or not the military minute details, whatever the tactical level changes, the operational level changes. That's not where the shit is going to be. So what what is the fallout from this? Or what was the question that someone asked, what happens from here? To be honest, very little indeed. And I know that's not what people want to hear, but I'm saying it how it is. Yeah. And often military analysis does not care for your preferences, right? A lot of reasons people really hated the Israeli-Palestinian thing is because when you're a military analyst, literally just looking at the Israeli operation, you're literally, you're pro what they're doing. No. I never supported what Israel was doing, but you just have to understand what they're doing from a cold, hard calculus basis. It's game theory, right? You have to think about the next moves ahead and how it plays out. Otherwise, you have no ability to plan. So that's my opinion on it. We're obviously going to reconvene and talk about developments, and hopefully perhaps a little bit more constructive than this afternoon's. But no, I think it's very good.
I think this afternoon for anyone who watches this back, I think we had a tremendously wide-ranging conversation, which in many ways I thought was sort of not more interesting in a flippant way, because obviously the war in Ukraine is incredibly important. But, you know, I think it was wider ranging and, you know, a good discussion on lots of different things, including Byzantine history and or Game of Thrones, all coming in and sort of talking about, you know, the world that we're in.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think that it, you know, I have to say, guys, I think of all our live streams, this has probably been my favorite so far.
No, it's been great fun. And I think we've covered a lot of things which was absolutely not Ukraine, NATO. So I'm not entirely sure what to bloody title this stream. But someone has put in this, which I obviously me with my Irish partisan, I've been consistently wrong, even though I correctly predicted the war when it happened. Okay, but anyway, thank you, Social Minds. Exactly, I am 100% right. Exactly. I don't know, guys. Maybe we should wrap it up.
I will. Yeah, I'll finish out with just 4 things that I have to say. And you know, I started out by saying that James and I take two alternative routes, and we come to the same bar, kafana, taverna. Piotr, you take a third route, but we all come to the same route at the end of the day as well. I just a few final things before we break here. A couple of people in the comments have said that the evening chats are fantastic. This is early afternoon for me. I still have lunch. I still have lunch to make. I have papers to grade. I've got shit to do for tomorrow.
It's 9:30 in the evening where I'm talking to you from.
It's whatever. It's the last day before Orthodox Lent begins, so I've got one final day before I have to go all monastic.
Well, it's a national holiday here tomorrow, so anyone celebrating of the Orthodox, it's Clean Monday or Green Monday.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it as well. That's why I have to get rid of all the mead.
For anyone who doesn't know, it's I don't know if in how many Orthodox countries, but I know sort of certainly here in Cyprus, it's, you know, traditionally you go out into the fields and eat vegetables. And
yes, that's a Greek and Cypriot thing.
I don't know if other Orthodox countries.
Let me throw in my last comments for the evening before we break. As far as the sanctions against Russia is concerned, I think, Piotr, you mentioned this way in the beginning of our conversation today, and that is that sanctions against Russia have not only been normalized, I think this was expected. So the international isolation, at least coming from Europe and from the US, was planned. Right, was definitely planned. So in my course that I offer on conflict resolution, and we have a dedicated lecture, a dedicated section on the role of sanctions and do they work? Are they effective? And one of the things that I've come to realize is that international sanctions need to work within 6 to 12 months. Otherwise, they won't. That's the bottom line. If it's a small country, sure, that's to be expected. If it's a larger country like Russia or the US or China or whatever, there are ways around it. There is always ways of sanctioning.
Can you argue that the case of apartheid South Africa kind of challenges that?
Yes. No. Where is apartheid South Africa today?
Well, no,
most of them are now seeking refuge in Trump's America.
But you're saying that sanctions, if they didn't work within the first 6 to 12 months, weren't useful, but their sanctions were in power for decades.
If sanctions work, if and only if the world at the time is willing to participate in all of them. If China and India and the rest of the global South and the global East had said to Putin, within the first month or so after the outbreak of the special military operation, we are engaging in sanctions as well. If Central Asia had also said we're engaging in sanctions, this war would have been over, right? Would have been done. But if the only countries that are imposing sanctions on Russia are the countries of the European Union and a number of other Western countries that are leaning towards that, Russia can survive. And this is how they have been managed. This is how they've been able to make it to what is effectively the 4-year anniversary in 2 days. To the second point, where will Russia go after Putin? Somebody had mentioned in the comments, at some point, time is going to have the final say. Putin is mortal. This is a very, very controversial subject in Russia. Very controversial. Nobody talks about right now who will lead Russia after Putin. What I can say, and I am about 85% confident in saying this, is that do not expect open elections to bring a reformer or a pro-Western Democrat into Russia. Russia is run by what we would call the Siloviki, of which Putin is a member of. People tend to think that, Putin has just captured the Russian political apparatus all by himself. He would never be able to be where he is today without two things. Number one, the Siloviki, and number two, the security apparatus, which is the FSB, which lost no time transitioning from KGB to FSB. The security apparatus runs everything behind the scenes. And so the successor to Putin will largely be somebody who, at the absolute best, is somebody that Putin designates, or at the absolute worst, somebody that the Siloviki throws up from behind. I cannot say with certainty, but right now, the only person that I can look at is perhaps Andrei Belosov, who is the Minister of Defense. The Ministry of Defense. I could be wrong. On that. The third thing that you bring up is the war, and the idea that the Russian economy has now kind of harnessed itself to a wartime economy. Congratulations. So has the United States. The United States has harnessed itself to a wartime economy since the Second World War. When wars end, economies, and Piotr, I'm absolutely certain, we have done everything possible to not break away from a wartime economy since 1945. The whole consumerist boom afterwards has all been about buy. Look up consumerism in the United States. That is the whole thing that we need to look at. It doesn't necessarily imply imperialism, but let's be honest. The United States absolutely benefits off of destabilizing other countries, as well as creating that sense of crisis in which economies do not recede back to wartime, peacetime economies. That is one thing that has not happened. And finally, the world as where we are is more than just simply Ukraine. I think that one thing that we brought out of this conversation is that Ukraine has now become, at the absolute best, a topic that explains what else is going on in the world, which is why I said it's difficult to decouple Ukraine from what is happening in the Middle East, in Latin America, from the musings of the Trump administration and a number of would-be opportunists who are looking to take MAGA into a post-Trump scenario.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, I would say two quick counter arguments, which is simply, I take your point about the Siloviki. Absolutely, Putin was but one player or cog within a broader machine. But in the time that he's been in power, he has purged quite a lot. Whether or not that means he's purged effectively enough that the Siloviki has no subsequent influence in a post-Putin Russia, I'm not sure. I can't. To be honest, I just don't know what Russia's going to look like after Putin. I have absolutely no idea. I always used to think of Patrushev as a bit of a decent subsequent, replacement of Putin, but he's older than Putin. Belosov,
charismatic, and he's not charismatic either. He does not have that leadership. Nope.
And Belosov is a decent shout. He has that economic component. He's young enough, but I just don't think Putin even has considered this, right? But I don't want to get into that right now, so I'll park that there. The other point you said about what was your final point about Ukraine and its relevance to everything else? I think so. I think that the Ukrainian war is such a symbolism, which is why there's been such an explosion of fascination and emphasis on it as a niche, if you like. And I don't like to put it like that, but how many people have become something on YouTube or on the internet because of the war in Ukraine?
Absolutely. No question about it.
And it circles back to our rather sort of conceptual, theoretical conversation earlier, about idealism. Ukraine, for many people, represents the main defender of a lot of the principles that we uphold in the West, or the defense of democracy and these sorts of things, which is why I think it speaks to so many people. But from just simply a pragmatic standpoint, I think that not much is really going to happen this year. I think it's 27 maybe. There's obviously always the talk about China and Taiwan in 27. So I think that there's a lot of stuff there that we can unpack in a subsequent conversation. But
remember, Putin, as far as I'm concerned, Putin's term ends in 2030.
No, I put 2036.
30? Really?
Yeah, because he'd be old enough at that point, really aged.
No, but I think his 2 terms are up. I could be wrong.
Well, but does he? So what? Like, his 2 terms were up in 2008, 2012, right? So he's just going to find a way to manipulate the constitution again. I don't see why he would change anything, or what's going to happen. I cannot, and I don't know what Russia represents without Putin. He is so intrinsically linked. Mm-hmm. Russia is Putin. Putin is Russia, right?
So ultimately, the biggest thing, I'll finish out by saying this before we give the thing to James, is that I think this is probably Russia's biggest Achilles heel right now, is explaining Russia without Putin. Yeah, absolutely.
No, the lack of life planning, right? I was having a conversation with my financiers the other day. I don't have a life plan in play. I'm being slightly facetious, everybody, but if you don't plan for your what comes up, they say, no, all I talk about Russia being a great country.
If he is able to find a successor that effectively allows him to retire to his, dacha and live the rest of his life. This is ultimately what the old timers want. If he can go to his dacha and just, live out the rest of his life, and, that's it.
If he truly cared about the longevity and glorification of Russia, he would have a plan in place. But I genuinely don't know if he has. And if he does, he's very good at keeping it under.
That's very often leaders don't want to, because it provides a blueprint for their ousting.
That's another topic for another time.
Yeah, but you don't want to let on that you've thought of a successor, because then other people think, well, maybe we do need that successor. So yeah, this is often a problem. But I mean, it's a very clear signal of a dictatorial system, and where challenges arise, you either make sure that you then promote another challenge, or you just get rid of them, frankly, even if they are very close. So yeah, interesting times on all that. But
that was a brief wrap up, James.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's just, I was thinking, do you know what? Funnily enough, of all the things that sort of, I've been thinking a little bit about is our talk about Byzantium, because Byzantine history is sort of one of my sort of real interests. And I was sort of, I was reminded when we were talking, that bit about Belisarius. But in actual fact, a lovely book that I would really, really recommend is it's written by a Byzantine historian called Michael Rossi.
Yes,
and it's called 14 Byzantine Rulers,
Emperors. Yep,
and it is a wonderful, wonderful book if ever you can, and it is historiography written at the time by a courtier monk who wrote about recollections of the various emperors, and my favorite of those is Constantine IX Monomachus. And it's a very, very funny story as well. But it's a brilliant book, and I don't know why. I think part of it is because it was such an interesting period of great turbulence, of course, and there is a lot that is tied up there, and I think sometimes we do forget the role of history in understanding what we're seeing at the moment, and interesting parallels and things. So anyway, I just wanted to say, amongst sort of, recommendations of TV shows like Andor, which I can't recommend highly enough, as I say, this book, Michael Rossi, 14 Byzantine Rulers.
14 Byzantine Rulers.
It's wonderful.
14 Byzantine Rulers. Yeah, I mean, emperors, it can be translated in various. I knew it as 14 Byzantine Rulers, but there might be another edition which published it as emperors. I just need to point out that, last year, 2025 was the 1000th anniversary of the death of Basil II, so little silent, memorial to Basil II. Basil Bulgar Octonos, yes. And we had about a 50-year period of what the hell was going on before the Khomeini had come in and just can I just say, Alexios, John, and Manuel, you are well loved in this.
Gosh, you're absolutely right. 1,000 years. Wow. Time passes so fast.
It has.
Where has the time gone?
I know. Seriously. We've been here for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Where has the time gone?
No, I realise the live stream's gone on, but I'm just thinking about the and there's a final recommendation on something completely different, guys. My mind was absolutely blown. The Rest is Science did an episode a couple of weeks ago on numbers, and I promise you will not regret watching it. It is one of the finest podcasts I've ever seen, and their explanation of 52 factorial will blow your minds. Absolutely. Wow. If you only listen to one other thing this week apart from our live stream, make sure it's The Rest is Science on numbers, and that bit on 52 factorial. I promise you will be thinking about it for years to come.
All right. Well, I've just shared eyes with my partner here, and she's a mathematician. So we're going to be watching that now as we
seriously. All we're talking about
after we finish this stream, we're gonna do that. But I do want to. I'm going to be honest that my laptop's about to die. I had 90%. Started this distillation, so I want to end it before we just abruptly stop, since it's we're hosting it from my from the StreamYard. But everyone, thank you very much for watching. This is a completely randomized subject title. Do check out Michael's channel. He does important things. Michael, you need to start uploading if you want to change your channel, as you put a month ago that you have.
I was saying the same to him. Michael, go on. You can. You want to do it.
Well, I will say, as a shameless plug, I will say next week I do have a live chat with who do I have scheduled? I have Pascal, Nikolai Petro, Glenn Deason, and Jeffrey Sachs. We are all going to be talking about the 4-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine and where that goes. That's going to be at least another 2-hour podcast. We'll see, how that manifests.
And that's on your channel, is it?
That is going to be on my channel, yes. And
great stuff, fabulous.
A lot of stuff behind the scenes, but you're absolutely right. I do apologize to everybody for being a bit incognito. I am a full-time professor and I have papers to grade and other stuff, but that does not give me an excuse to be absent from YouTube. So I really want to thank Piotr and James once again for giving me the opportunity to speak with you guys for 2 hours and change, and letting everybody know that rumors of my disappearance are, highly exaggerated. And yes, left-wing nationalist, that Jeffrey Sachs as well. That Jeffrey Sachs.
You're gonna take both of us in subscribers then. He's very popular.
Seriously. I think I'm going to channel and head over to yours now.
Yeah, if I'm going to hit a ball, I'm going to hit it out of the ballpark.
A lot of interesting conversations, right? You've had a lot of interesting conversations. You've made that interesting.
Yes, it's gone a little bit quiet. Yeah. No. I was going to say no. At my end, I'm just in the process of about to move house, and I won't bore you with all the details. But it might mean that I'm going to be a little less regular on posting for a couple of weeks. I'm trying to pre-record a few videos, so that I can make the move. But it probably will mean that this will be one of the last videos with this sort of setup. I'm planning to do something a bit different. Well, that's the aim. But I'm for a liberal, I'm very conservative. So don't be surprised if I just replicate it in the new place. But so that's a big thing at my end going on.
All right. Well, it was great seeing you guys once again. And
for me,
I want to thank everybody for being on board with, it was a great talk that we had today.
Great stuff. Night all.
Yeah, it was fun. Hey, I haven't done my sign off yet.
Oh gosh, sorry about that.
No, thanks so much.
Oh,
25 minutes.
we've lost you, Piotr. You're
no,
great
do check out the guys'
yeah.
work. I have a couple. I have a couple of ideas now that you've mentioned it, and I'm going to float them on air with us because I think that the audience will be very excited for that. I have a couple of unique ideas that could work quite well between the three of us, especially Michael, if you're actually going to start becoming a productive member of society on YouTube, not just in the backdrop of occasional. I will be on Sky News, as I said, on Tuesday. And I'm going to Bologna next week to meet, to attend a couple of events, one of which is with Christine Lagarde, who is dropping out of the ECB as leadership. And I think that's because she wants to run as candidate for the French election next year. We've got a few exciting things. I'm also working on something with The Economist. So if you're interested, then you should be subscribed to all of us, I think is the point I'm getting at here, because we all have something to offer, and I think it's pretty thing, but always arrive to a similar conclusion. But with that, everyone, thanks very much for watching. Cheers.
Speak soon.
Yep.
Bye, Daryl.
Happy Sunday.